Chapter 3, History, Politics, and Economics. This particular chapter is quite a big chapter, and there's actually a lot of information in it. But I'm just actually going to hit some highlights, not only in this lecture video, but in the lecture notes themselves. You'll notice that I sort of skip through some of the information. It doesn't mean that it's not necessarily important. It just means that in order to understand the overall big picture of what we're talking about when it comes to environmental science, we just need to hit very briefly on some of these topics. So my 5 points for this particular lecture. First, we're going to talk about the difference between conservation and preservation. Next, we're going to talk about how the environmental movement started. Then we're going to talk through an important piece of environmental legislation. Lastly, we'll talk about the role that economics plays in environmental science, and then we'll talk finally about pollution control strategies. So let's start off first with our big point number 1 in this chapter, and that's the difference between conservation and preservation of resources. So as a reminder, a resource is any part of the natural environment that can be used to promote the welfare of people or any other living thing. So again, as we discussed, all living things need resources in order to survive. And in general, we can say they fall into the category of resources being as part of our food, water, shelter, and space. We need those things in order to survive. We have a couple of different things we can do to protect our resources. And it comes into this discussion of conservation versus preservation. So let's talk about conservation first. Conservation is simply when we carefully manage our use of natural resources. So we're still using them, but we're using them in a way that is sensible, i.e. we're not degrading the resources. So if you think of farming, for example, you can do several different things in order to preserve soil, which soil is one of the most important parts of farming. You need good soil in order to be able to grow crops. Well, soil is a resource. Well, how do we protect that resource? Well, there are things that we can do to conserve it. We can use smart, sensible types of irrigation to grow more food on less land. We can rotate crops to make sure that the soil stays fertile. We can make our farmlands terraced to prevent soil erosion. So again, we're using the soil, we're growing crops, but we're doing so in a carefully managed way. That's conserving a resource. That's not the same thing as preservation. Preservation is when we completely set aside something and we don't use it. So we're maintaining the resource in a pristine state, and we protect that resource from any human activity that might alter it. So this is what we do when we set aside a national park, or when we set aside a wildlife refuge. We're saying you can't touch anything that's in here, any of the resources. We're going to completely protect them. So that's the difference between conservation and preservation. Conservation, we're still using the resources. We're just using them smartly. Preservation, we're not using the resources at all. We're protecting them from human activities. All right, let's move into big point number 2, and that is the environmental history of the United States. Very briefly, to summarize it quite simply, it was extremely destructive for the environment. So when the colonials first came over here to the United States, there was a prevailing attitude of conquering nature. So we had colonials that were moving into different parts of the eastern United States, and they were making it their homesteads, and they were chopping trees down, and they were trapping fur animals, and they were living off the land. It was this very much conquer, go west attitude, and that continued after the birth of our nation, and all the way through the 1800s we had this prevailing attitude of conquering nature, and it was extremely destructive. We grew as a population, we grew as a country, but it was bad for the native wildlife, and not to mention the native people who were here as well. So we conquered nature. We profited from it. We had no interest in protecting it. It wasn't until actually about the 1960s when people began to become concerned about the environment. They said, hey, our water is pretty polluted and we don't like the chemicals that are in the air and things are kind of bad. So maybe we should do something about it. It kind of was an environmental awakening, if you will, a consciousness in the people that said, hey, business as usual is not going so well for other living things, and humans are going to be impacted as well. So beginning in about 1970, we had the first Earth Day, and we began to tell people about, hey, the environment is important. Let's do things to protect the environment. And so not only did people start to become interested, but we also urged our politicians to listen to us as well. And that's when we began to create some important pieces of environmental legislation. So this is big important point number 3 is important environmental legislation. And the biggest was probably the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA. Through this, we created the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency was important because we began to have rules and regulations, and we began to say, look, you can't just do whatever you want to the land. There has to be consequences. You have to make a plan. You have to decide how you're going to protect water and how you're going to conserve soil and all of these different things that the government was now accountable for. We also created the Council of Environmental Quality, which again was important because we began to look more closely at projects to see what impact they might have on the land itself and the water and the animals and things like that. So all of these environmental rules led to a series of regulations, and these regulations were important because once they were drafted through legislation, they could go to the EPA, and then the EPA could implement them as rules. And some of our most important pieces of environmental legislation, we've done great things since the 1970s. We've saved species, we have clean water and clean air, and we conserve energy, and all of this is because of these environmental policies that were put in place in the 1970s. National parks, clean water, good stuff. Moving on to important point number 4 is how economics plays a role in environmental science. Briefly, economics is how we study limited resources and how they're used to satisfy unlimited wants, basically supply and demand. I have something, you want it, I sell it to you for a particular price. The economy, everyone's economy, depends on resources in the natural environment. Things in the natural environment, resources, are used for raw materials, and it's also where we put all of our waste products, i.e. our pollution after we're done making something. So the natural environment is incredibly important as both what we call a source for raw materials and also a sink for our waste products. Natural capital is essentially just all of the resources that sustain living organisms, including humans. And so the environment is providing us natural capital for our production and consumption. If we use too many of our sources, we're going to overuse them, and it's called resource degradation. If we use too many of our sinks, we have pollution. So we could use up all our resources and we could pollute our environment. I'm going to kind of quickly jump over this part right here, but essentially what this says is every country's gross domestic product is based on how much goods and services that they produce. The problem with the current way that we recognize this is that we're not taking into account resource degradation. We're not taking into account all of the pollution that we're creating. So the pollution control, we have 2 different ways that we can do it. Command and control, which is basically we put rules into place. Whether you like it or not, industries, people, businesses, you have to follow the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. It's rules followed by punishments. The other way we can do it is through what's called incentive-based regulations. This is when we do tax credits and permits, such as caps and trades. That's it for Chapter 3. Again, please make sure you read the rest of the notes so that you understand fully what this chapter is about.